What caused medieval marriages to crumble? What could turn a seemingly solid union into a bitter feud echoing through the village square? Was it the lack of shared Netflix passwords? Or who hogged the bed linens? Or was it something far more fundamental, far more brutal, hitting at the very core of survival in the 14th century? Number 7. Differences in social conduct and public image. In the vibrant, often brutal world of the Middle Ages, one's standing in the community was everything. It shaped opportunities, alliances, and even daily survival. Marriage, far from being just a romantic partnership, was a cornerstone of social reputation, a public declaration of one's place in the hierarchy. When one's spouse's behavior began to chip away at that carefully constructed image, marital disputes inevitably flared, sometimes with explosive consequences. It was not merely about personal annoyance. It was about the potential ruin of a family's name, its future prospects, and its very ability to function within the tightly knit social fabric. A medieval husband or wife was expected to uphold certain standards of public decorum, to present a united front that reflected favorably on their household. Deviations from these unspoken rules, whether intentional or not, were fertile ground for conflict that extended far beyond the private chambers of a couple. Consider the expectations placed upon a woman, particularly in the middling ranks of society. She was the mistress of the household, expected to manage servants, oversee domestic production, and entertain guests with grace. Her piety, modesty, and industry were not just virtues. They were public signals of her family's respectability. If a wife, for instance, became known for excessive gossiping at the town well, for being overly boisterous during public festivities, or for neglecting her attendance at church services, it reflected poorly on her husband. He might be seen as lacking control over his own household, or even worse, as tolerating ungodly or unseemly behavior. Records from the bishop's court at Lincoln, dating to the early 14th century, reveal instances where husbands sought various forms of redress, not for outright adultery, but for a wife's perceived wandering eye or her overly friendly demeanor with other men at market. These were not direct accusations of infidelity, but rather complaints about behaviors that could easily lead to accusations, or simply undermine the husband's standing as a man whose wife was above reproach. The shame associated with such public perceptions could be immense, leading to arguments that spiraled into accusations of disrespect and even moral failure. A man might feel that his wife was deliberately sabotaging his social climb, or simply too oblivious to the delicate dance of reputation. Conversely, a husband's public misbehavior could equally devastate his wife's position and the family's honor. If a man was known to be a frequent brawler in the taverns, a loudmouth who insulted his social superiors, or a gambler who squandered his family's meager income in plain sight, his wife suffered the direct consequences. She might be ostracized by other women, her children looked down upon, and her own efforts to maintain a respectable home undermined by her husband's antics. A fascinating collection of urban court records from Paris in the late 13th century, preserved in the city archives, detail numerous cases where wives petitioned for separation or complained bitterly about their husband's public conduct. One particular case involved a merchant's wife who claimed her husband's constant public drunkenness and his habit of loudly disparaging his neighbors had made her a laughingstock and ruined her ability to conduct her own small trade in fine linens. She argued that his behavior was not just personally offensive but economically ruinous for the entire household, preventing her from engaging in the social networking necessary for her business. His lack of social grace was a direct threat to her livelihood and the family's solvency, turning domestic friction into a public. Sometimes, the disputes revolved around differences in piety, a crucial aspect of medieval social conduct. While religious devotion was paramount, individual expressions of it could vary. A deeply devout wife might be distressed by a husband who rarely attended Mass, scoffed at fasting days, or openly mocked religious processions. This was not just a matter of personal faith. it could cast a shadow of suspicion over the entire household, potentially inviting scrutiny from church authorities or the scorn of more pious neighbors. Conversely, a husband might find his wife's excessive devotion, her frequent pilgrimages, or her generous almsgiving to the point of impacting the family budget to be a source of public embarrassment or financial strain. Chronicler from the Burgundian court in the 15th century recounts a nobleman who complained bitterly that his wife's extreme piety and her habit of giving away their household goods to beggars was making them seem impoverished and eccentric in the eyes of their peers, thereby diminishing his standing at court. He felt her actions, however well-intentioned from a spiritual perspective, were undermining his political and social ambitions. The pressure to conform to social norms was relentless. For a night, his wife was expected to be a gracious hostess, capable of managing a large household and entertaining noble guests without blemish. Her demeanor, her dress, her conversation, all were extensions of his honor. If she was perceived as rude, ignorant, or ill-mannered, it would reflect directly on his ability to attract allies or maintain his reputation for gentility. Similarly, a peasant woman relied on her husband's reputation for industry, honesty, and good neighborliness. If he was known to be a lazy farmer, a deceitful trader at the market, or prone to disputes with fellow villagers, it would impact their access to communal resources, their ability to borrow tools or labor, and their children's marriage prospects. The ripples of a spouse's poor social conduct spread far and wide, affecting not just the marital bond but the very fabric of their social existence. These disputes over public image were often simmering beneath the surface, exploding when a particularly egregious act brought shame upon the family. A husband might lash out at his wife for flirting openly with a traveling merchant, fearing the gossip that would inevitably follow. A wife might publicly confront her husband for boasting about his illicit affairs, knowing that such talk would damage her own reputation as an honorable woman and potentially harm her children's marriage prospects. The medieval world was a small world, where reputations were built and destroyed through word of mouth, and a scandal could travel faster than any horse. The disputes were not just about private feelings. They were about the very public performance of marriage and family life, where any misstep could lead to devastating social repercussions. The expectation was that a married couple would operate as a unified, respectable entity within their community, and any action by one spouse that undermined this unity or respectability was a profound source of contention and an almost certain cause of bitter marital dispute. Historical accounts from various English manorial courts consistently show cases where disputes between spouses arose directly from a perceived lack of deference or respect shown by one to the other in front of third parties, or from actions that brought collective shame upon the household, demonstrating how deeply intertwined upon the household. Number 6. Interference from in-laws and extended family. Imagine living in a world where your marriage wasn't just between you and your spouse, but involved a sprawling cast of characters who often lived under the same roof or just next door. In the Middle Ages, the family unit was often expansive, extending far beyond the nuclear couple. In-laws, siblings, aunts, uncles, and even distant cousins frequently played active, sometimes intrusive roles in a marriage, turning minor disagreements into major conflicts and sometimes leading to outright marital breakdown. This pervasive influence of extended kin was a constant source of friction, a relentless pressure cooker for any marital bond. It was not uncommon for a newly married couple to live in the husband's parents' home, especially in agrarian societies where land was inherited and families needed many hands for labor. This meant the bride entered a household where she was not mistress, but a new member, often subject to the authority of her mother-in-law. The mother-in-law was a particularly common antagonist in medieval marital disputes. She might view her son's new wife with suspicion, seeing her as a competitor for his affection, or as an outsider threatening established household routines. A young bride might find herself constantly criticized for her cooking, her cleaning, her management of the chickens, or her inability to produce a male heir quickly enough. Her mother-in-law, accustomed to running the household, might refuse to relinquish control, undermining the new wife's authority and creating a hostile environment. Particularly detailed account from the records of the Peculiar of the Dean and Chapter of York, dating to the late 14th century, describes a case where a husband, Thomas, brought a complaint against his wife, Alice. The core of his complaint, however, was not about Alice's behavior towards him, but about her incessant quarrels with his mother, who lived with them. Thomas lamented that his mother and wife were constantly at odds, arguing over household chores, the care of their children, and even the allocation of food. He claimed this perpetual conflict had made his home a hellish dwelling, disrupting his peace and making him question the viability of his marriage. The court's documents reflect a common medieval sentiment. Domestic harmony was paramount, and in-law disputes were a direct threat to that harmony. Fathers-in-law could also be a source of significant tension, especially concerning property and inheritance. A father might be reluctant to transfer control of land or assets to his son and daughter-in-law, or he might interfere in the young couple's financial decisions, leading to bitter arguments about control and autonomy. The dowry which the bride brought into the marriage often remained under the control of her father or brothers, who could refuse to release it or demand its return if the marriage faltered, creating a complex web of financial and familial obligations that could pull a couple apart. A number of 15th century court cases from the Duchy of Burgundy show husbands complaining that their wives' families were withholding parts of the agreed-upon dowry, or that the wives' brothers were continually demanding financial support from the couple, despite their own limited resources. These external pressures created immense stress within the marriage, often leading the husband to resent his wife's family and, by extension, his wife, for the financial strain they imposed. Billets, too, could stir the pot. A jealous sister-in-law might spread rumors or sow discord, while a protective brother might intervene in spousal disputes, escalating minor arguments into major confrontations. When a family relied on communal labor, as was common in peasant households, friction between siblings and their spouses over work allocation or shared resources could easily spill over into marital strife. Imagine a brother-in-law who constantly demanded his sister's husband help with his harvest, leaving the husband with less time for his own fields. Such a situation would undoubtedly lead to arguments between the husband and wife, with the wife caught between loyalty to her birth family and loyalty to her husband. Historical records from manorial courts in various parts of England frequently detailed disputes between neighbors, which often reveal underlying family tensions. It was not uncommon for a husband to bring a complaint against his wife's brother for trespass or theft, only for the court proceedings to reveal a deeper, long-standing feud involving the wife caught in the middle. These interfamilial feuds often became intertwined with marital stability. The pressure from extended family members could be particularly acute when a couple failed to produce children, especially male heirs. A mother-in-law might openly express her disappointment, blaming the daughter-in-law, or even encourage her son to seek an annulment or a new wife. The weight of family lineage and the continuation of the family name was immense, and a wife who seemed barren often faced immense pressure not just from her husband, but from his entire extended family. Case recorded in the Archiepiscopal Registars of Canterbury in the early 14th century shows a husband seeking an annulment on grounds of his wife's alleged inability to conceive. While his own desire for an heir was clear, the testimony also heavily featured the strong pressure and public shaming he had received from his powerful noble family, who desperately needed a direct male line to inherit their estates. His wife, in her defense, spoke of the constant scrutiny and cruel remarks she endured from her in-laws, making her life unbearable and exacerbating the marital tension. Even distant relatives could exert influence, especially in matters of social standing or political alliances. Marriage was often a strategic tool to cement power or wealth, And if one spouse's family felt the other was not holding up their end of the bargain, or if the couple failed to produce heirs, family councils could put immense pressure on the marriage. These external forces could turn a private disagreement into a public drama, with each side drawing support from their respective kin. Common scenario detailed in legal treatises of the time, such as those from the legal schools of Bologna, discusses how a family, particularly a powerful one, might intervene to persuade a couple towards separation or annulment if the marriage was deemed no longer politically or economically advantageous. Such external pressures, often backed by significant social and financial leverage, could easily overwhelm a marital bond, making it impossible for the couple to navigate their issues privately. Constant presence and often unsolicited advice or demands from in-laws and extended family members were a foundational cause of medieval marital disputes, turning many unions into battlegrounds where the couple was often caught in the crossfire of larger family politics and expectation. Number 5. Refusal of conjugal rights and issues of procreation. Marriage in the medieval period was first and foremost a sacrament in the eyes of the Church, and one of its primary purposes was procreation. The marital debt or conjugal rights referred to the expectation that spouses would engage in sexual intercourse, not just for pleasure, but for the possibility of conception, and for the mutual support inherent in the marriage bond. When one spouse consistently refused these conjugal rights, it became a grave matter, often leading to deep marital disputes and frequently petitions for annulment in the church courts. This issue went far beyond mere physical intimacy. It touched upon the very purpose of marriage, the continuation of family lines, and the salvation of souls. It was a complex issue, laden with theological implications, societal pressures, and personal anxieties. The most straightforward manifestation of this dispute was the outright refusal of one spouse to engage in sexual relations with the other. This could be due to a genuine aversion, a secret vow of chastity made before marriage, impotence, or simply a deep-seated resentment that led to a withholding of intimacy. For the spouse who was refused, this was not merely a personal slight. It was a denial of a fundamental aspect of their marital agreement, a betrayal of the sacrament itself. Records from various diocesan courts across medieval Europe, such as those from the Archbishop's Court of York, frequently show cases brought by petitioners seeking annulment on the grounds of malice of bed or frigidity. Typical complaint might involve a husband stating his wife had denied him her body since their wedding night, leaving him unable to fulfill the procreative purpose of marriage and casting doubt on the validity of their union. These were serious accusations, requiring physical examination by midwives or doctors, and sworn testimony from neighbors or servants who could attest to the couple's separate sleeping arrangements or other telltale signs. The shame and frustration for the denied spouse were immense, as it often implied a fundamental flaw in the marriage, or even in their own attractiveness or ability to inspire affection. Beyond outright refusal, issues of procreation themselves could become a major source of conflict. The inability to conceive children, particularly male heirs, placed immense pressure on a medieval couple. While barrenness was generally attributed to the woman, medieval understanding also acknowledged male impotence. Regardless of who was perceived as the cause, the lack of offspring, especially after several years of marriage, could strain a relationship to its breaking point. For noble families, the continuation of the lineage and the inheritance of lands and titles were paramount. A childless marriage could threaten an entire dynasty. This led to bitter accusations, desperate pleas, and often the search for legal avenues to dissolve the marriage and try again with a new spouse. A case from a French royal court in the 13th century involved a powerful baron who sought to annul his marriage to his wife of 10 years, citing her inability to bear children, despite the fact that she had suffered several miscarriages. His family had pressured him relentlessly, fearing their name would die out. The wife, heartbroken, testified about her emotional suffering and the blame she received from her husband and his kin, even though the issue was possibly beyond her control. The inability to fulfill the procreative aspect of marriage, whether due to physical barrenness or repeated miscarriages, became a central point of contention, transforming shared sadness into bitter accusation. Sometimes, the dispute was not about the absence of children, but the sex of the children. While less common as a direct cause for annulment, the consistent birth of daughters when a male heir was desperately needed could also lead to significant marital friction. A husband, particularly in a noble or landed family, might express his frustration and disappointment, implicitly or explicitly blaming his wife. This often manifested as psychological cruelty or a withdrawal of affection, turning the marital home into a place of quiet resentment. Although the church would not annul a marriage for having too many daughters, the pressure from family and society to produce a son was immense, and the strain it placed on a couple was undeniable. Chroniclers often record the desperate efforts of queens and noblewomen to produce a male heir, and the often public disappointment of their husbands when another daughter arrived. These were not direct disputes over conjugal rights, but rather over the outcome of those rights, nonetheless creating deep divisions within the marriage. Another related issue was the perceived inability of a spouse to consummate the marriage due to physical impediments, whether natural or supernaturally induced, such as witchcraft, a belief not uncommon in the medieval period. If a marriage could not be consummated, it was not considered a valid marriage in the eyes of the church, and an annulment could be granted. This was a highly invasive and humiliating process, often involving physical examinations and public testimony. The dispute here centered on the very reality of the marriage. If one spouse claimed non-consummation, the other would often fight fiercely to prove it false, fearing the public shame and the loss of their marital status. A particularly famous example, though often embellished, from the English royal court involved allegations of impotence which were debated extensively and publicly. While specific details often remain shrouded, these cases highlight the extreme lengths to which medieval couples and their families would go to either prove or disprove the fulfillment of conjugal duties, seeing it as the foundation of their entire marital existence. The refusal of conjugal rights or the failure to procreate thus triggered a cascade of legal, social, and personal consequences. It was a dispute that questioned the very validity and purpose of the marital bond, transforming it from a sacred union into a legal battleground. The stakes were incredibly high, encompassing not just the couple's happiness, but the continuation of family lines, the inheritance of property, and the public honor of all involved, making it a profound and common source of bitter contention in the medieval world. The intimate nature of the complaint, combined with its public airing in court, ensured that these disputes were deeply scarring for all parties involved, leaving lasting scars on their personal lives and public reputations. Number 4. Cruelty and neglect, physical and emotional. While the medieval world had a different understanding of personal rights and domestic relationships than our modern sensibilities, excessive cruelty and neglect were recognized as legitimate grounds for marital dispute and sometimes for separation in the church courts. This wasn't merely about occasional arguments or harsh words. It referred to systematic physical violence, severe emotional abuse, or the deliberate withholding of essential necessities like food, clothing, or shelter, rendering the marital home unbearable. The expectation, even within a patriarchal society, was that a husband would provide for and protect his wife, and that both spouses would treat each other with a certain degree of care, if not always tenderness. When these fundamental expectations were violated, marital harmony shattered, often leading to desperate measures. Physical cruelty was a tragically common complaint. While a husband might be expected to chastise his wife, there were limits. Repeated beatings that inflicted serious injury, such as broken bones or permanent disfigurement, were considered beyond the pale even by medieval standards. A wife suffering such abuse had little recourse in secular law, but the church courts offered a glimmer of hope. She could petition for a separation from bed and board, known as divortium, a mensa et thoro, which allowed her to live apart from her husband without dissolving the marriage itself. This provided physical safety, though it often left her in a precarious financial position. Records from the consistory courts of various dioceses, such as Salisbury and London in the 15th century, contain numerous petitions from wives detailing horrific acts of violence committed by their husbands. One case involved the woman, Agnes, who testified that her husband, Robert, had repeatedly beaten her with sticks, punched her until she bled, and threatened her life, forcing her to flee their home on multiple occasions. She presented witnesses who corroborated her story, often neighbors who had heard her cries or seen her injuries. These accounts paint a grim picture of domestic life gone awry, where the fear for one's physical safety became the dominant force driving the marital dispute. The husband, in turn, might argue that his wife was disobedient or provocative, trying to justify his actions, but sustained severe violence was often deemed unacceptable. Beyond physical blows, deliberate neglect could also constitute cruelty. This was particularly true if one spouse willfully failed to provide for the other, especially in cases of illness or destitution. For example, a husband who abandoned his wife, leaving her without means of support, or who refused to provide food and shelter, could face legal action. Similarly, a wife who neglected her husband during a severe illness, or who refused to perform her domestic duties to the point of causing hardship for the household, could also be accused of neglect. While less dramatic than physical violence, this form of cruelty could be equally devastating, threatening the very survival of the neglected spouse. A compelling case from the Norwich Consistory Court in the early 1400s involved a sick man, John, who claimed his wife, Elena, had refused to prepare him food, mocked his illness, and locked him out of their house in winter, forcing him to seek shelter with neighbors. His argument was that her actions constituted a deliberate abandonment of her marital duties and put his life in peril, thereby proving her cruelty. Such examples illustrate that neglect, when severe and willful, was seen as a profound breach of the marital contract, giving rise to legitimate disputes. Emotional cruelty, though harder to prove and less frequently cited in formal legal proceedings than physical abuse, was undoubtedly a significant cause of marital friction. Constant verbal abuse, public humiliation, or the systematic undermining of a spouse's reputation could make life unbearable. While the courts might not always intervene in such cases unless they escalated to physical threats or public scandal, the personal suffering caused by such behavior was immense, leading to a breakdown of communication and mutual respect. A popular medieval proverb stated that a nagging wife is worse than a demon, highlighting the cultural awareness of verbal torment, even if legal recourse was limited. Yet, some court records do allude to this, especially when combined with other forms of cruelty. Chronicler's report from a German city in the 13th century tells of a craftsman's wife who sought refuge in a convent, claiming her husband's constant accusations of her infidelity, his public disparagement of her family, and his threats to despair. While there were no physical blows, her plea for separation cited intolerable mental anguish and constant fear, noting how severe emotional torment could be a breaking point for a marriage, even if less formally recognized than physical violence. The abandonment of a spouse was another grave form of neglect. If a husband simply left his wife and children to fend for themselves, without any intention of returning or providing support, it was a clear violation of his marital obligations. The deserted wife was left in an incredibly vulnerable position, often without legal standing or financial means. She might appeal to her own family, the church, or the community for assistance, but the abandonment itself was the source of profound dispute and grievance. Church, in particular, viewed desertion as a serious offense, as it violated the sacrament of marriage and left one party in spiritual and temporal peril. Surviving court records from the Diocese of England frequently contain petitions from wives against husbands who had eloped or absconded, leaving them destitute. These cases often reveal the desperate struggle of deserted women to maintain their households and protect their children's legitimacy, highlighting the profound impact of such neglect on their lives and the broader community. Ultimately, disputes arising from cruelty and neglect, whether physical or emotional, struck at the heart of the medieval marital ideal, a union meant to provide mutual aid and solace. When one spouse became a source of terror or profound suffering, the foundations of the marriage crumbled, leading to desperate pleas for intervention, and often the painful dissolution of shared life, even if the marital bond itself remained legally intact. These were not minor squabbles, but battles for survival and dignity, frequently drawing in legal and ecclesiastical authorities, and serving as stark reminders of the vulnerabilities inherent in medieval marriage. Number 3. Adultery, illegitimacy, and reputational damage. In the medieval world, adultery was far more than a personal betrayal. It was a grave offense with profound social, legal, and spiritual consequences that could shatter a marriage, ruin reputations, and even affect lines of inheritance. The accusation of adultery, whether true or false, almost invariably led to bitter marital disputes, often drawing in the wider community and the church courts. The issue was not simply about fidelity, but about the purity of the family line, the honor of the husband, the legitimacy of children, and the very fabric of social order. A wife's adultery was generally viewed as more serious than a husband's, primarily because it introduced the risk of illegitimate heirs inheriting property or titles, undermining the husband's lineage and authority. The revelation of adultery often triggered an immediate and intense marital dispute. A husband discovering his wife's infidelity might react with fury, leading to violence, public shaming, or immediate separation. For him, it was a direct attack on his honor, his perceived control over his household, and the legitimacy of his children. The very thought that children he believed to be his might, in fact, be another man's, was deeply unsettling and financially ruinous if those children were set to inherit his lands or assets. Records from the court of the official of the Bishop of Hereford in the 14th century document numerous cases where husbands accused their wives of adultery. One such case details a husband, Richard, who claimed his wife Catherine had engaged in an affair with a local miller, resulting in a child that was clearly not his. Richard brought witnesses to testify about Catherine's clandestine meetings and a physical resemblance of the child to the miller, demanding that Catherine be publicly shamed and that the marriage be separated. These accusations were often deeply humiliating for the accused wife, and the subsequent legal proceedings could be lengthy and agonizing, with the entire community watching. Conversely, a wife's discovery of her husband's adultery, while not carrying the same threat of illegitimate heirs to her lineage, still led to significant disputes. A husband's infidelity could bring shame upon the family, demonstrate a lack of respect for his wife, and often involve the squandering of family resources on his mistress or illegitimate children. While the Church's stance on a husband's adultery was less severe in terms of annulment, it was still considered a sin and a breach of the marital contract. A wife might complain bitterly about her husband's frequent visits to brothels or his open cohabitation with another woman, arguing that such behavior diminished her standing, consumed family wealth, and endangered her soul. She might petition the church court for an order compelling him to return to her bed and board, or for a separation if his actions were deemed intolerable. A fascinating case from a French royal court in the 15th century involved a prominent noblewoman, Lady Jean, who sued her husband, Sir Guy, not just for his numerous documented affairs, but for the substantial sums of money he spent on his mistresses and their illegitimate offspring, which she argued was impoverishing their legitimate children and undermining their family's noble status. Her dispute was as much about the financial consequences and reputational damage as it was about personal betrayal. The birth of an illegitimate child was a particularly explosive event, especially if the child was born to the wife. This instantly raised questions of paternity. and could lead to accusations of adultery against the mother. The legal and social consequences for such a child were severe. They could not inherit, their social standing was low, and their very existence was a blot on the family's honor. For the married couple, the appearance of an illegitimate child was almost a guaranteed trigger for a profound and often irreversible marital dispute. The husband would likely disavow the child, leading to fierce arguments and public condemnation. The wife, if proven to have given birth to an illegitimate child, faced severe penalties, including public penance, loss of dowry, and permanent separation from her husband. Scholars studying medieval legal records, such as those analyzed by Richard Helmholtz concerning English ecclesiastical courts, highlight how cases related to disputed paternity and alleged illegitimacy were among the most frequent and complex forms of marital litigation, signifying their immense importance and capacity for generating deep marital friction. Even the suspicion of adultery without concrete proof could fuel intense marital disputes and cause immense reputational damage. Gossip was a powerful force in medieval communities, and a whispered rumor about a wife's indiscretion or a husband's philandering could destroy trust and honor. A husband might become intensely jealous and possessive based on flimsy evidence or local gossip, leading to constant accusations and monitoring of his wife, transforming their home into a battleground of suspicion and resentment. A wife equally might feel her reputation being unfairly tarnished by her husband's suspicious behavior or by rumors he himself was spreading, leading to a profound sense of injustice and a desire for redress. The mere shadow of scandal could be enough to unravel a marriage, as honor and reputation were so intrinsically linked to one's identity and standing in the medieval world. A well-known incident from a Florentine merchant family's correspondence in the 14th century describes how a husband, hearing unsubstantiated rumors about his wife's conduct during his absence, subjected her to such cruel accusations and public humiliation upon his return that she sought refuge with her own family, refusing to return to him until her name was cleared, demonstrating the immense power of rumor in sparking disputes. In essence, adultery and the question of legitimacy were not merely private matters of infidelity. They were public offenses that threatened the lineage, inheritance, and social honor of entire families, acting as a potent catalyst for some of the most bitter and long-lasting marital disputes in the medieval era. The legal and social mechanisms put in place to deal with these issues reflected their severity, ensuring that these disputes were not just personal quarrels, but matters of profound societal concern. Number 2. Financial mismanagement and debt. Money problems are timeless, and in the medieval period, they were a devastating source of marital disputes. While modern couples might argue over credit card debt or a shared budget, medieval financial disputes often concerned land, livestock, inheritances, dowries, and the very means of survival for the entire household. When one spouse mismanaged resources, accumulated overwhelming debt, or squandered family wealth, it threatened the economic stability of the entire household, leading to intense conflict and often the ruin of the marital bond. In an era where economic security was precarious for most, financial mismanagement was not just an inconvenience, it was a profound crisis. One of the most common scenarios involved a husband squandering family assets through poor investments, excessive spending, or outright gambling. While a wife had limited legal control over family property, especially landed estates, she felt the immediate and direct consequences of her husband's financial recklessness. If he sold off inherited land without her consent, pledged their future harvest as security for a frivolous loan, or lost valuable livestock in a foolish wager, it directly imperiled her children's future and her own security. A wife might find herself facing destitution, her children without an inheritance, all due to her husband's poor decisions. Records from English manorial courts and French seigneurial courts in the 13th and 14th centuries contain numerous complaints from wives who allege their husbands had wasted their substance, alienated their dower lands, or pawned their household goods. Without legitimate cause, these complaints often reveal desperate women seeking intervention from local lords or church officials to protect what little remained of their marital estate. One case from a court roll in Kent, dated 1345, details a woman, Emma, who accused her husband Geoffrey of selling off their oxen vital for plowing to fund his drinking habits, leaving them unable to sow their fields and threatening them with starvation. This direct link between financial mismanagement and immediate hardship fueled bitter arguments and lasting resentment. Conversely, a wife's financial mismanagement could also lead to serious disputes, though her avenues for large-scale squandering were often more limited given her lesser control over significant assets. However, she might incur minor debts with local merchants, trade goods unwisely, or be accused of petty theft that brought shame and financial penalties upon the family. In merchant households, where women often played an active role in business, a wife's poor judgment in trade or her accumulation of debts without her husband's knowledge could be a significant source of contention. Particularly detailed account from the Livre des Raisons, household books, of a Parisian bourgeois family in the early 15th century includes entries where the husband, a successful draper, meticulously recorded his wife's seemingly extravaging. He consistently noted his disapproval and the financial strain these expenditures placed on his business, culminating in bitter entries about her persistent inability to manage our funds with prudence and her stubborn refusal to understand the limits of our purse, indicating ongoing unresolved disputes. Debt itself, regardless of who incurred it, was a pervasive problem in medieval society and a constant source of marital stress. Peasants often owed rents, services, and taxes to their lords. Artisans and merchants extended credit and sought loans to acquire raw materials or expand their businesses. If one spouse became entangled in unmanageable debt, it put the entire family at risk, potentially leading to the loss of land, tools, or even personal freedom, as debtors could sometimes be imprisoned or forced into servitude. Arguments about who was responsible for the debt, how to repay it, and what sacrifices had to be made inevitably arose. The fear of destitution, the loss of social standing, and the shame associated with unpaid debts fueled profound anxiety within the marriage. Historians analyzing urban archives, such as those of Bruges and Ghent, find frequent records of debt litigation involving married couples, where one spouse might blame the other for reckless borrowing or for failing to collect what was owed to them, highlighting the individual responsibility in meritless buckshowing caused by financial oblations. Disputes also arose over the management dowry and dower. The dowry was the property or money a wife brought into the marriage, often meant to provide for her and her children. The dower was the portion of her husband's property a wife was entitled to inherit upon his death, typically 1/3. Disagreements could flare if a husband tried to alienate or squander his wife's dowry, or if a wife felt her dower rights were being threatened by her husband's reckless spending. These were legal matters, but before they reached a court, they were often bitter personal arguments. A wife, knowing her future security depended on the careful management of her dowry, would fiercely resist any attempts by her husband to diminish it. Conversely, a husband might resent his wife's control over her dowry, feeling it restricted his own financial freedom. A late 12th century English legal treatise, Glanville, outlines various scenarios for dowry disputes, indicating their common occurrence and complexity. And it is clear that such disputes would first arise as personal conflicts before escalating to the legal arena. Ultimately, financial mismanagement and debt were not abstract problems in the Middle Ages. They were direct threats to the very existence of a household. When one spouse jeopardized the family's economic survival through imprudence, extravagance, or poor judgment, It inevitably led to intense marital disputes as the other spouse fought to protect their shared future and their children's inheritance. These arguments were often about basic survival, leading to desperate measures and permanently damaging the trust and cooperation essential for a medieval marriage to endure. Number 1. Property and inheritance disputes. In the medieval world, nothing fueled marital disputes quite like matters of property and inheritance. More than mere possessions, land, animals, tools, and the rights to future earnings represented power, status, and the very foundation of a family's survival and legacy. When these vital resources were perceived to be threatened, mishandled, or unfairly distributed, the marital bond, often created precisely to consolidate or expand such holdings, could fracture irrevocably. These were not simply arguments over who owned what. They were existential battles for control, for the future of one's children, and for the perpetuation of the family name. The stakes were incredibly high, often far outweighing personal affection or loyalty. One of the most common flashpoints was the dowry. The dowry was the property, money, or goods that a bride brought to her husband upon marriage. It was intended to support her in the marriage and provide for her should she become a widow. While technically her husband managed it, the dowry was usually considered to be her property, and disputes often arose if the husband squandered it, invested it poorly, or refused to return it to her or her family if the marriage ended in separation or annulment. For the wife, her dowry represented her financial security. For her family, it was a significant investment and a symbol of their daughter's standing. If a husband, through reckless spending or poor management, diminished the dowry, his wife would feel betrayed and financially vulnerable. Numerous cases in the church courts, such as those documented in the Act Books of the Consistory Court of Canterbury in the 14th and 15th centuries, record wives' desperate pleas for the return of their dowries from husbands who had misused them. A specific instance involved a noblewoman, Lady Eleanor, who accused her husband Sir Hugh of selling off valuable pieces of her inherited land, which formed part of her dowry, without her consent, using the proceeds to fund his military campaigns and gambling debts. She argued that he was deliberately impoverishing her and their children, leading to a bitter and prolonged legal battle that ultimately destroyed their union. Her struggle was not just personal. It was a fight to preserve the economic future for herself and any offspring. Equally contentious was the dower. This was the portion of a deceased husband's property, typically 1/3 of his lands, that his widow was legally entitled to for her lifetime support. Disputes often arose if the husband, before his death, tried to circumvent his wife's dower rights by secretly selling off land, transferring it to male heirs from a previous marriage, or attempting to disinherit her in his will. The wife, knowing her future security and status depended entirely on her dower, would fight fiercely to protect her. Even during a husband's lifetime, if he engaged in behavior that seemed to threaten her future dower rights, it could lead to profound marital friction. A husband might, for instance, favor a son from a previous marriage, attempting to settle more land on him than what was due to his current wife's dower, thereby sparking furious disputes within the household about fairness, inheritance, and the future provision for their children. Records from the Court of Common Pleas in England dating from the 13th century show many widows fighting their stepsons or other relatives to secure their rightful dower, battles that often stemmed from underlying disputes with their husbands during their lifetimes, demonstrating how the shadow of future inheritance could haunt a marriage. Inheritance from other sources, such as a parent's death, could also ignite conflict. If a wife inherited property or money from her family, her husband often assumed control over it, but disputes could arise if he refused to acknowledge her right to it, tried to prevent her from accessing it, or again, squandered it. Similarly, if a husband inherited significant property, the wife might have strong opinions on how it should be managed or divided, especially if it affected the prospects of her children versus other potential heirs. In societies where primogeniture, inheritance by the eldest son, was common, the birth of sons from different marriages or a strong desire for a male heir when only daughters were born could lead to extreme marital tension over who would inherit what. The desperation for a male heir to secure inheritance was a pervasive anxiety, often turning a couple's inability to produce sons into a bitter blame game and a cause for potential annulment or separation, fueled by family pressure to secure the lineage and property. Particularly striking example from a Venetian family chronicle in the 15th century details a merchant, Signor Marco, who after several daughters became openly hostile towards his wife, publicly accusing her of being unfruitful in producing male heirs and even attempting to transfer his business and property to his nephews, sparking a vicious internal family misdispute with his wife and their grown daughters. Furthermore, control over shared marital property was a constant source of friction. In many medieval households, both husband and wife contributed to the family's economic life, whether through farming, crafts, or trade. While the husband typically held ultimate legal authority, the wife's labor and contribution were vital. Disputes could arise if one spouse felt the other was not contributing enough, or if decisions about selling products, purchasing goods, or investing in the future were made unilaterally. Imagine a peasant couple arguing fiercely over whether to sell their last milking cow for cash or keep it for its milk and calves. Such decisions, seemingly minor, were critical for survival and often led to heated arguments about trust, shared responsibility, and economic foresight. Custom from a village in Picardy, France, from the 14th century, outlined specific rules for a husband's management of the common property, implying that disputes over such management were common enough to require codified customs. Finally, disputes over lineage and family honor were intimately tied to property. A marriage might be arranged to consolidate land holdings between two families. If one spouse's family then failed to uphold their end of the bargain, or if a perceived slight damaged the standing of one family, it could lead to intense pressure on the married couple. They were, in essence, caught between the competing demands and property interests of their birth families, leading to disputes that were far larger than their personal relationship. The feudal system, with its complex web of allegiances and land tenure, frequently saw marriages made and broken based on shifts in power and property, with the spouses becoming pawns in larger familial strategies. The history of royal and noble houses is replete with examples of marriages dissolving or becoming bitterly contentious due to property disputes between powerful families, demonstrating how fundamental these issues were, even for the most elite. In essence, property and inheritance were the lifeblood of medieval existence. They dictated social standing, guaranteed survival, and shaped the future. When these fundamental aspects of life were threatened by mismanagement, dispute, or competing claims, the marital bond, which was often a conduit for their transfer and protection, became a battleground, leading to some of the most bitter, protracted, and devastating conflicts. These disputes often extended beyond the couple, drawing in entire families and legal systems, highlighting the immense importance placed on land and lineage in the medieval world.